Alrighty, well, we might kick off. Welcome and thank you all for coming today to our webinar series. Today's webinar is around assistive technology and how to get what you need. We will do a bit of a brief presentation, but we'll also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So it'd be lovely if you give me plenty of questions. Before we start, there is two features that you can use to do that. There is a chat box, and the chat box is at the bottom of your screen in the middle. You can type in questions at any time, and there's also the Q&A system, which is also down the bottom of the screen, which will allow us to tick off any questions that are answered. So again, thank you for joining me. My name's Jess. I'm an occupational therapist by background, and I'm the National Operations Manager for Care Squared. And today we're going to venture down the assistive technology pathway, which some OTs call a bit of a black hole, but once you understand it, it works. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about what is a functional assessment, and this has come off the back of a request from a previous webinar. So what is a functional assessment? What do they look like? What questions get asked? How do I know if I'm getting what I need? We'll talk a little bit about the assistive technology complexity levels, what that means for us, you know, an iPad versus a power wheelchair sort of thing. We'll also talk about the process, and for that I'll focus primarily on level 3 and 4, which is complex assistive technology. And we will probably have an interactive discussion around the timeframes, because I'm sure everyone on the line's had varying experiences. Now, just before we kick off, if you could type into the chat box below your role. So what's your role in the NDIS? Are you a participant? Are you a nominee? Are you a worker? Are you a support coordinator? What do you do? Just so that I can make sure that any examples I give are relevant to you and your role. So we'll just pause for a minute while everyone types that in. Fab. A lot of support coordinators. Great. Okay. Now, I am not going to assume how much knowledge you do or don't have as a support coordinator in terms of AT, but certainly hit me with as many questions as you like as we get to the end. I'm just going to minimize the chat window so I don't distract myself as we go through the presentation. Okay, so yes, that is our agenda. So let's talk occupational therapy. So for starters, AT can fall into a couple of fields, which is important to note. So you've got occupational therapy, who seem to be the catch-all for everything AT. Then you've got speech therapy, a speech pathologist. Now, they typically will do AT for things called AAC, which is the complex assistive communication devices. So sometimes you might have a combination of OT and speech pathology if you're looking at things like eye gaze technology or the image systems where you have different images for communication. The other person that's a little bit rarer but also exists in the AT space is a physiotherapist. So if you've ever had a request for an exercise bike or orthotics, they will probably sit in the physiotherapist space. And certainly AT fits into the prosthetist space, which is looking at prosthetic limbs, whether that be, you know, an arm or whether that be an actual orthotic per se. So there is a little bit of overlap. There are some clear boundaries, but I would suggest if you're not sure who's the best person to prescribe your AT item, make sure you just ask, and we'll be very able to tell you what we can and can't do. One thing that you should note is things like a CPAP machine, which is for sleep apnea. OTs, physios, speechies cannot prescribe those items. They have to come from a nurse or a specialist doctor. That's where that health-related disability supports come into play. Anyhow, let's talk about occupational therapy. So just briefly, OT is anything, you know, is a therapy of helping people achieve the things they need to do, or the things that they want to do, or the things that they have to do. So OT is always about goals. It's always about function. It's not about, you know, a ticker box or cookie cutter approach. I'm very much an advocate of an OT assessment should never be a dining table assessment. And what I mean by that is that we shouldn't be sitting around a table having a chat. That will form part of an assessment, but that's not the whole assessment process. What it should be is a whole of a house assessment, and that sounds a bit funny, but what it should be is there's likely a dining table portion of the assessment, but to be able to assess your function or your participants' function, I actually need to see them interacting with their environment. So I need to see that they put their hand on this part of the wall every time they sit down. And so the things that I might look at as an occupational therapist is dirty handprints on the walls. They're actually one of my greatest tools for AT and home modifications. So what am I looking at? I'm looking at the person interacting in their environment. And then I'm looking at, well, what are the difficulties? What are the issues? What are their needs and preferences? And what are some potential solutions to that? So I might be asking some strange questions. So how does it feel when you do that? Or does that feel comfortable? Do you feel safe? How do you go doing it this way? And if we look at reasonable and necessary criteria, AT and home mod is not always the first solution. Sometimes we have to look at things that might be a more simple or more cost-effective approach. And if that's not successful, then we look at AT home mod. So you might find that as an OT, I'm standing there watching your participant, step over the lip into the shower, but in my head, I'm going through 100,000 different solutions on a sliding scale from, would a grab rail work to fix this solution? No, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? So that's how our brains work. We go through this scale of simple to complex, and obviously the simpler, easier options, if they work, they're always going to be the most sustainable. So whole of house assessment, it should involve things like, let's go for a walk around the block if that's appropriate to your participant or for you. It should be, let's step on and off the, sit on and off the toilet. Let's step over the lip of the shower. Let's get in there. You don't have to have a shower if that's not appropriate. But I need to see you, how you do the taps. I need to see you if you hold onto the wall or hold onto the shower screen and what that looks like. So it is all about observations of function, and it should be, and certainly then questions to clarify anything. And if you stumble, for example, I might say, did you stumble because I'm standing here watching you, or because you felt unsafe, or did you lose your balance, or what happened there? Because it's a very different suggestion. I stumbled because I couldn't see this versus I stumbled because I overbalanced. Very different solution. So the questions are there to get a bit more understanding of what's going on for that person. Now, the really key thing is that there's no point looking at function or doing an assessment if I don't know what that person's goals are. Now, they could be the NDIS goals, but often they are the intermediary goals that feed into those NDIS goals. So the NDIS goal might be, I want to be more independent with looking after myself. That's probably a good OT, but that kind of level. But their intermediate goals might be that I want to go to the toilet on my own and not have someone help me. So I need to know what that is, because otherwise I might be looking at the backyard, at the clothesline, and not at the toilet. I need to know what their needs are. So that's where I'm looking at people and understanding what they can do and what's the trouble will give us an understanding of what their needs are. Then their preferences. Now, a classic that you'll hear if you spend much time doing AT assessments is, I don't want that thing, it looks like it's in a hospital. That's fine, and there are options for people who don't want things that look like they belong in a hospital. So it's really good to know these things ahead of time. So a functional assessment, most of it happens inside the OT's head. You're not going to see a whole lot, except you'll see me following the person around their house and watching everything that they do, and probably asking some funny questions along the way. But if I'm sitting at the dining table and I don't move from the dining table, unless we're assessing the dining table, I'm not quite doing the right thing. So AT complexity is the NDIS world, how we look at things. So this works for both assistive tech and home modification. So I might go through them both. And there are 4 levels of complexity, and then the process changes for each of those things. And then for most of the support coordinators on the line, you would know the mid-level AT process, the under $5,000, which is the complex, strange one that sits in the middle. So level 1 AT is simple. It is low risk. It is off the shelf sort of things. It's like a non-slip bath mat. You don't need an OT for that at all. In fact, a participant can go out and purchase that and seek reimbursement as they need. Level 2 AT is slightly more complicated, but still quite simple, quite off the shelf. It's things like a walking stick, potentially. Level 3 is where you start getting into a little bit higher level of risk or customization. And that could be things like, oh, someone raised their hand. I don't know what that means. Allowed to talk. Connie, I'm going to let you talk. I think you might have a question. Connie, I'm sorry, I can't figure out the tech. If you have a question, would you mind typing it into the chat bar for me and we can come back to that? All right, I've got the chat bar here, so I'm looking at it as you go. So level 3 is where we get a bit more complicated, a little bit more custom, a little bit more risky. So things like a good example here is a wheelchair. So they can, the complex off the shelf wheelchairs sometimes fit in a level 2, sometimes a level 3. And things like a bed stick. So that sounds really simple and really straightforward, but actually bed sticks are really high risk. So bed sticks fit into level 3 because there have been a lot of deaths caused by bed sticks. Simple as it sounds, it's not. Level 4 is where you get to very high risk or fully custom made or very expensive items. So things like a customized power wheelchair that's $15,000 to $20,000 will sit into here. Things like high level alternating air pressure mattresses and things like that. And then the processes vary accordingly. So what I would recommend is that the NDIS updates things on AT all the time. You would know this already, but I would jump on the website anytime you're unsure. Things do change, and we've had some changes recently with the COVID as well. So now I'm talking here about the complex AT. So if you have a level 1 or 2 AT, as I mentioned before, you don't need an OT assessment. You just need to go out and purchase, and the participant can be reimbursed via the portal. So here I'm talking about the process for complex things. So level 3, level 4. Now, what needs to happen is a functional assessment or functional analysis. Now that plus or minus a report doesn't matter, whatever suits the participant's needs, but you need to really get a good understanding of the function. What are the needs? What are the preferences? What are the issues? What are the goals, as we talked about? The next step of that is that the OT will identify a number of options that potentially meet the person's needs. So that might be, you know, if we're talking about mobility, it might be a range of things from a walking stick to a customized power wheelchair, and then different brands and different options in there. So identifying a number of options. Once the OT's narrowed that down to probably about 2 or 3 options, then we do a trial. So what that would involve, and this is not for home mods, of course, I can talk about that separately, but what a trial would involve is getting the supplier to bring out those options to the person's home, to their environment, getting them to have a play, a trial, see if they like the option, see if it meets the functional needs, making any adjustments as needed with the rep, and just kind of honing those 3 options down to one ideal option. From there, if it's a level 3 or 4 assistive tech, we need to do an assistive technology report. Now, the good thing is the newer form, which is probably about 12 months old now, enables us to do multiple pieces of assistive tech on one report. The old form, multiple reports for multiple items, a big waste of time. But now we can do all items on one report, and it's quite a comprehensive report. So that's why I say that the functional assessment report is neither here nor there in this process. You don't necessarily need it, but you definitely need the AT report. Connie, I see your question about a bed rail. I will come back to that for you. So AT report is a comprehensive summary of how that assistive tech option meets that person's needs, and the OT has to then step out with reasonable and necessary criteria. From there, this is where some OTs call it the black hole, as I'm sure you can appreciate, but it goes into the NDIS for approval. The challenge as OTs is that we do not have the ability to check on that process. And often when we call, they say, sorry, can't talk to you. Needs to be the participant or their nominee that calls us and asks about it. Sometimes this process recently has taken a week or two. In the past, taken up to 12 or 18 months. So when I say time frame, could be anything really sometimes. Once that thing is approved, then, my apologies, my technology. Once that thing is approved, the supplier will deliver it. They'll arrange for delivery. And then one of the really key pieces of assistive technology prescription is that the OT pops out once it's delivered. Make sure that it fits, make sure it's adjusted properly, and make sure that the training is provided to the participant, the nominee, or the support staff, or whomever needs to use it, so they're using it in a safe manner. Because there is nothing wrong, nothing worse than providing AT that's not used properly, and then it hurts the person. So I might go to Connie's question here. So she said, I was once asked about a bed rail. My participant was falling a lot and it was very affordable, but NDIA queried the fact that not having the bed rail would be safer than not having it, as he could fall and hit his head, and the result would be more harmful than not having it. So yes, Connie, absolutely. Yeah, technically they're cheap and you can even buy them at Kmart and Aldi at the moment. But the reason they sit in the level 3 risk categories is simply due to risk. And the reason for that is a lot of people in nursing homes have either fallen and hit their heads or fallen between the bed rail and the bed and not been able to get out. So one of the key things that we look at in prescribing a bed rail, they can be really effective, and for some people they work really well. But key things we need to look at is that person's cognition. So if they were to fall and get stuck in there, do they have the ability to ask for help or get out? Also looking at their physical function, do they have, you know, if someone with Huntington's disease, for example, might have rapid movements of their limbs and they're at risk of hitting themselves on it. So it really is, as you've said here, a more harm than good situation. So it is a risk assessment in every instance to prescribe a bed rail, which is really confusing to describe to people because they can go and purchase one from Kmart without anyone questioning it. That is a really good question and one I get frequently. Thank you for that. Question. Very good question, Debbie. With the AT report, can a physio do that for mobility related AT, such as a standing hoist or shower chair, or does it need to be an OT? No, is the short answer. A physio can do that. My experience has been that most physios don't want to do that, is your only challenge, but they certainly can. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. They do have to say who they are and why they're appropriate to be prescribing that. But mobility related AT is certainly well within the physio world. Just looking at shower chair, you don't need an AT report, but on the flip side, a wheeled commode, you do need an AT report, and that might have to come from an OT. But certainly a standing hoist could easily come from a physio. Any other questions, everybody? I've reached the end of the content, so we've got about 8 minutes left for further questions. But either into the Q&A section down the bottom or the sorry, I'm just marking your question as answered, Connie. If equipment is already purchased, ooh, that is a good one, Megan. So there's a lot of toing and froing about retrospective AT reports. Yes, in short, hang on, if it's already purchased, will an assessment be? So no, you won't have to do an assessment to use it. but often people may go out and purchase something and then want a retrospective AT report to then be funded and reimbursed. So I think you'd probably be aware the NDIS, yes, Connie, that's right. The NDIS generally doesn't like to fund retrospective purchases or reimburse, so I'd probably avoid that if you can. In terms of continuing to use equipment, it's about safety. So if someone needs an assessment because they've got a hoist but their support worker's changed over, for example, they might need an assessment to train that support worker, not so much an assessment, but some services to train that support worker in using the hoist safely for that participant. In that instance, that's appropriate. You may not need an assessment per se, but more just some intervention training time. But certainly if you're looking at an assessment with a report for retrospective AT, just be really careful. NDIS have said they won't do it, but I have seen them do it. So probably not 100% solid answer there, Megan. Connie has said, with some OT, they put recommendations in their reports. Yes, absolutely, I agree with you there. So that's probably in relation to where I said you don't necessarily need a functional assessment report for AT. Now, the reason I say that is because the AT stuff goes in the AT report. However, if you're going for a plan review or the AT isn't listed in the plan, then a functional assessment report would be A+, because you need that to justify the funding for the capital supports. So then you can do the AT report. So yes, you've got a good one there, Connie. NDA don't want to go through with this as it should be gotten from health department. What should our procedures then? Connie, do you mean assistive technology that the NDIS has knocked back and said it should have gone through Department of Health? Or should be funded by the health system? Yes, okay. Good question. It really depends what the assistive technology is. There are still the state-based, that's a good question, I'll come back to that, Megan. There are still the state-based equipment schemes for participants who may not, or for even people that aren't eligible for the NDIS, Connie, so that's an option. So for example, in New South Wales, it's called Enable. In Victoria, it's called SWEP, and there's a similar scheme in every system. So that might be for things like a CPAP machine or diabetes monitoring equipment. That has recently changed with the health-related supports though. So if that got knocked back last year, you might want to revisit that and see if it's now something that can be included under those cost items. Megan's comment here is a good one, restrictive practices. Yes, in short. So this is actually a really good question that I would like to have included actually, Megan, thank you. Restrictive practices are tricky because OTs are not typically the behaviour support practitioner. So the process gets a little bit convoluted in that you need the behaviour support practitioner to have done their assessment. They need to write their BSP, and if that includes restrictive practices such as bed rails or maybe even safety glass on the windows, at that point you engage an OT to say, here's the BSP with that restrictive practice included in it. We now need you to prescribe it. That can be done collaboratively, but the challenge is if you don't have the BSP practitioner involved, then you run into a problem because their job is to reduce restrictive practices. So if they can't demonstrate they've done that, an OT cannot prescribe it. Does that answer your question, Megan? Yep. Yeah. Okay. Just let me do this. Another question. Aha. Connie, that's a really good question as well. So sometimes the OT or AT has been recommended when the accepted diagnosis is mental health. I think you've nailed it on the head there, Connie. Sometimes does, sometimes doesn't. So the real key there is in the justification. So it's in how we, how we demonstrate that that item meets the reasonable and necessary criteria. And I would say that something like a walking frame can have an impact on mental health, but you've just got to write it the right way. So it would be something along the lines of, if this person falls over, hits their head, that can impact their mental health. And if they don't fall over, their self-worth is improved, and therefore this walking frame might help them to manage their symptoms, or something very much along those lines. But it's got to be goal related and it's got to make sense. You're right in that sometimes we can get physical AT through for people with mental health, and sometimes we can't, but it is all in the justification and reasonable and necessary criteria, Connie. We've probably got time for one more question if there is any. All right. Last chance, any further questions? Smartphones. Oh, Connie, I knew this question was coming. So smartphones are a bit of an iffy one too. However, there is the new information about teletherapy. So NDIA will support people to purchase through low-cost AT, a tablet, smartphone, laptop. Oh, participant lost 3 phones. That's probably a separate issue, Connie. But in terms of access to technology that will assist them to do teletherapy, yes, they can now access that through the low-cost AT. Just to make your life easier, have a look at the AT on the NDIS website. They've got really specific instructions. The other one they've got on there is about iPads. So they've said they'll support up to $600 for a tablet, which doesn't cover the cost of an iPad. However, we regularly see people get approved for iPads, so that's just a yeah. In terms of your participant losing 3 phones, Connie, I'd probably tackle that at a different angle, and I'd say, what's the functional reason they're losing 3 phones? Is it cognition? Is it behavioural? You know, what is it? And then could we look at another solution to solve that problem for that person so they're not losing their phones? In which case you could justify an AT item that meets that need. So it could be a phone with a strap, or it depends on the person's needs. Okay, everybody, we've reached the end there. I'm happy to answer any more questions, but otherwise, thank you all so much for coming along. We do have a couple more webinars in our series, primarily around speech therapy and communication. The details are on the screen now, also on our website if you are interested in any of those. But otherwise, have a fantastic day, and thank you all for coming along.